PC disassemble. Step 1. Unplugging. Unplug every cable that is connected to the computer. Wear a grounding strap or touch an unpaid metal part of the computer to discharge any static electricity. If you walk across a carpet at any point, touch an unpaid metal part of the computer again to discharge the built-up static electricity. Step 2. The casing. After your computer is unplugged, move to a clean working space, preferably a table. First of all, take the black casing of the PC by sliding it towards the front side. Then, place the case at the side as you don't need it anymore. Step 3. The power supply. The power supply is a large metal box located in the top left corner. The power supply supplies power to every component in a computer. Therefore, it has the most wires out of every other component in the computer. The first thing you do is unplug every wire coming from the power supply. The list below is everything that you have to disconnect: motherboard, CD or DVD drive power, internal hard drive power, portable hard drive slot power. Step 4. CD or DVD drive. This is one of the easiest components to remove. Just push the gray metal and pull out the drive. Step 5. System fan. Most computers have two fans: the system fan, the one blowing air into the computer, and the CPU fan, the one blowing air onto the CPU heatsink. The system fan is located at the back side of the computer, the side with all the component plug-ins. First, unplug the fan from the motherboard. You can find the plug by following the wire from the fan. It should be labeled SYS_fan1. Next, you will have to unscrew the fan from the outside. Step 6. CPU fan. The CPU fan is located right on top of the CPU heatsink, which is a large piece of metal with fans on the top. The CPU fan plugs into the motherboard, which is hard to access, but just follow the wires and you should easily find it. To remove the fan from the heatsink, remove the 4 screws, securing it in place. Step 7. Hard drive and floppy disk. Remove the metal casing on top side of the PC. Remove the hard drive and floppy disk combo from the computer. Then remove each. Step 8. The power switch. To remove the button, you will need to push it from the back, the side with the wires. For clarification, see the picture. So this is the button. So we need to remove it. We push it from the back, the side with the wires. It will become like this. Okay. Step 9. Random access memory. A RAM is a memory or information storage in a computer that is used to store running programs and data for the programs. So the more RAM you have, the faster your computer runs. Most computers have 4 or 2 RAM slots. To remove the RAM, push down on both tabs holding the RAM in place, which are located at both ends of the RAM. Step 10. CPU. Remove the CPU by walking the lever. Handle with care. Step 11. Heatsink. Take out the heatsink through the lever. Handle with care. Step 12. The motherboard. The motherboard is the mother of the computer. The motherboard links every component in the computer together. The CPU, RAM, and expansion cards are attached directly to it, and every other part of the computer is in one way or another attached to it. The motherboard has 7 screws holding it to the frame. which are indicated by large white circles around them. Remove those 7, then lift the motherboard out of the frame. Step 13. Done.
So the first one is Atx Power Supply. What is the Atx Power Supply? It is an electrical device that supplies electrical power to an electrical load, like this. And the primary function of a power supply is to convert electricity. The second one is RAM. What is the meaning of RAM? It is a random access memory. That is a form of computer memory that can be read and changed in any order. Typically, we use RAM. The third one is SATA cable, also refers as serial ATA, stand for Serial Advanced Technology Attachment. Is an industry standard bus interface for connecting a computer host. The fourth one is the simplest component in a PC or computer. That is screw. The function is to hold a component together, like when we are. The fifth one is I/O shield. It is simply for covering the back of your computer and for shielding your inputs and outputs from being layered around and damaged when you are plugging in or plugging out a system, such as the central processing unit, which we usually call as a CPU, and memory provides connectors for other peripherals. So the motherboard. So the sixth one is a motherboard. What is the motherboard? Motherboard is the main printed circuit board in general purpose computers, or like simply word, it is the place where all the component is most of the component is located, such as the RAM, the RAM, the processors, and other many important components in computer. It holds and allows communication between many of the crucial electronic components of the system, such as the central processing unit, or we call as CPU, and memory. Also, it provide connectors for other peripherals. So the motherboard shape looks like this. The seventh one is hard disk drive, or we call it as HDD. Some of you might confuse between SSD, or the meaning is solid state drive, and HDD, hard disk drive. Okay, it actually has the same function, but SSD is more powerful and more faster than HDD. By using CPU case. So the CPU case look like this. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to PC assembly part. In this part, I will show you how to assemble your PC. First thing first, you have to remove the side panel cover. In some case of desktop case, you have to loosen the screw of the side panel to open it. But in other case, you can simply with a little bit of force open it. Next is install the RAM module. Basically, we align the notch to the memory slot and place the RAM gently into the slot and make sure you fill in the case that is nearest to the CPU. Make sure you're gently and not put too much power because the pin of the RAM is very fragile. So press and hold both ends. Make sure the side is locked is in place. Now plug the pin CPU pen power connector like shown in the picture. After that, we plug the SATA cable to the motherboard and we plug the other end of the SATA cable to the hard drive like shown in the picture. Next is we align the power supply to CPU case screw holes. Power supply is very important. You can imagine it as the energy for your PC. Without it, your PC cannot turn on. Now, after that, we fasten power supply screws to secure its place. Next is we install the I/O shield. I/O shield is basically a shield for your input-output ports, for your audio jack or USB ports. Next is we install the motherboard and make sure the back end, which is your I/O port, is aligned to the I/O shield, and after that screw it into its places. And next we place the hard drive to the hard drive slots. Make sure to align the drive into the driver slots and screw the hard drive into its place. After that, we install the optical drive. Make sure to align the optical drive to its slot. Fasten the screw so it locks into its place. After that, let's install the 24 pins power connector. We plug one end to the power supply and the other end to the motherboard, like shown in the picture. Next is we plug the 4-pin CPU connector. One end is plugged to the CPU fan and the other end is to the motherboard. Next is we install the SATA power connector. One end is plugged to the hard disk drive or solid state drive and the other end to the motherboard. After that, we plug the SATA cable. One end is plugged to the hard disk drive or solid state drive and the other end is to the motherboard. Next is we plug the power SW connector. Basically like before, one end is plugged to the front panel of CPU and the other end is to the motherboard. Next is we plug the audio connector. One end is plugged to the front panel of CPU and the other end is to the motherboard. And the last component is we plug the USB port connector. Back before, one end is plugged to the front panel of CPU and the other end is plugged to the motherboard. And after we're done with that, just simply close the desktop case by fasten the screw, or in other version of desktop case, simply with a little bit of force, close it. That's all from me. Thank you.
PC assemble. Step 1. Open the case. Computer assembly is a large part of technician job. Prepare the workspace before opening the computer case. Step 2. Install the power supply. Insert the power supply into the case. Align the holes in the power supply with the holes in the case. Secure to the case using the proper screw. Step 3. Attach components to the motherboard. CPU on the motherboard, thermal compound, heatsink or fan assemble, install RAM. Step 4. Motherboard. After installing the previous components, the motherboard is now ready to install in the computer case. Plastic and metal stand-off are used to mount the motherboard. Step 5. Install internal drive. Drives that are installed in the internal base are called internal drive.
A hard disk drive, HDD, is an example of an internal drive. Step 6. Install drive in external base. Drive in external base allows access to the media without opening the case. Some devices are installed in this type of device are: an optical drive is a storage device that reads and writes information to CD or DVD. A floppy disk drive, FDD, is a storage device that reads and writes information to a floppy disk. Step 7. Install adapter cards. Adapter cards are installed to add functionality to a computer. Step 8. Connect internal cables. Power cables are used to distribute electricity from the power supply to the motherboard and other components. Step 9. Connect internal cables. Data cables transmit data between the motherboard and storage devices such as hard drive. Additional cables connect the buttons and link on the front of the computer case to the motherboard. Step 10. Complete physical installation. Now that all the internal components and the power supply have been installed and connected to the motherboard. And the last step is Step 11. Boot computer for the first time. When the computer is boot, the basic input-output system BIOS will perform a power on self-test BOST to check on all of the internal components. The BIOS contains a setup program used to configure settings for hardware devices. The configuration data is saved to a special memory chip called a complementary metal oxide semiconductor, CMOS.